everyone, it's Minutia Minute coming at you with kind of a lighter week for new DC books. While I was at the shop, I made the executive decision I was not going to be picking up Superman Red and Blue, only because I just don't really know what I would say about it. I've liked Batman Black and White stories in the past just fine, but at the end of the day, it's just going to be, a lot of little vignettes and all built kind of around the same gimmick. So I'm not going to pick up Batman Black and White, Superman Red and Blue, or the new Wonder Woman Gold and Silver, whatever it is. So that only left me with 3 new Infinite Frontier books. We had Nightwing 78, Catwoman 29, and Justice League 59. The first book I read this week was Nightwing. I was pretty excited about this book. It's Tom Taylor and Bruno Redondo, who I liked their work a lot in the old Injustice days, and so I was curious to see what he would bring to just an ongoing Nightwing title. And while I liked it, this book definitely gave me more zero-issue vibes than it felt like the beginning of a new arc. The book opens up with Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon meeting for the first time as kids before they're Batgirl and Robin, and they have kind of a interaction with some bullies that leads to kind of a nice Alfred moment when he gets back to the mansion. And from there we really just get a brief introduction to kind of the concept of who the villain's going to be, and we get the establishment of the new status quo for Nightwing, before leaving the book off without really giving us a sense of what the characters are going to be up to next. That said, what they set up in this book is promising, and I'm excited to read what happens next. We get the fake out that the villain of this book is going to be Blockbuster, who's basically shaking down the mayor because the mayor is not cooperating. He kills that mayor with his bare hands and establishes a new mayor who's intended as a puppet mayor, which we find out is Melinda Zucco. Zucco obviously is the family name of Tony Zucco, who killed Dick Grayson's family when shaking the circus down for extortion money in Robin's origin. So definitely some interesting threads to pull there, just not quite sure where they're going to go with it. Probably the more interesting development in this book is the fact that there's a pretty major change to the status quo for Nightwing, which is that he's rich now. Alfred has left him a pretty sizable amount of money, which makes him now the second person next to Lucius Fox, who's now richer than Bruce Wayne, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if they're going to basically continue flipping the script and everyone around Batman is going to be filthy rich and he's going to be poor, or what that's really going to look like long term. But could have some interesting implications. We'll just have to see where he takes that story, which ultimately leads me to why this book really does feel like a zero issue, because, again, they set the stuff up, but at the end of the read, you really don't know what the characters are going to do next, what the villains are really up to. No real sense of the plot, really just setting the tone, setting the preliminary stakes on what the story is you're going to tell. So if I had a complaint about Nightwing, it really would boil down to just being, I would have liked a little bit more content for the story. The art in it was good, I will say. I feel like Bruno Redondo as an artist has developed a lot since his Injustice days. I liked his art in that, but here it just feels like he's developed a little bit more of a clear voice. And I'm not sure if this is him or the colorist or the inker, but one of the things they employ in this book is quite a few of like the micro dots, like the comic book micro dots. You can actually see it even on the cover. And I thought it was used to good effect in this. It kind of gives it a little bit of a pop art quality, but without overdoing it. It doesn't overpower the art and it doesn't distract from the story. It's just kind of a pleasant nod, and I liked it. I haven't read a lot of Nightwing books. I've really just mostly read tie-ins. I remember the first Nightwing books that I picked up ever were the ones where Jason Todd was dressing up as Nightwing and trying to co-police Bloodhaven. I was super into Jason Todd at the time, and so I remember checking those books out. Beyond that, I really only pick it up if it's tying in with the main Batman story that's going on, so I make sure I have the full picture. So I'm excited to give this book a few issues and kind of see how it grows and give Nightwing a chance on his own. Nightwing 78 was an interesting start, but just ultimately a book that's too early to tell how I feel about it. After finishing up Nightwing, I went straight into Catwoman. I was pretty excited to check this book out. I was really intrigued by Ram V's Swamp Thing when I read that a couple weeks ago, which is the first book by him I've read, so I just wanted to see what else he kind of had going on in the DC universe and what other kinds of stories he could tell. And I will say right off the bat, something I quasi-noticed in Swamp Thing, but it really came into focus in this book, is Ram V is one of those writers where you really have to pay close attention because the way he writes is sort of heavily, like the plot will be heavily inferred through context. For example, in this, a large part of the exposition of who the villains are and what exactly it is that they're up to is really intended to be gleaned through the context of a conversation between two people over the phone that already know what's going on, so they're not really spelling it out for you. You're just intended to pick it up through subtext and through the art that is kind of juxtaposed with the conversation that they're having. To be clear, it's not a bad thing. It's just something that I noticed where I found myself having to go back if I wasn't reading close enough and like really pay attention to how the story was laying out. So essentially in this book, a currently unknown entity is manufacturing a drug that they've derived from poison ivy, who they have basically trapped in a glass bottle. When we first catch up with this scheme, we learn that they've figured out how to synthesize this drug without needing poison ivy, and so there are plans to basically incinerate her and get rid of her. We also find out that they've been testing this drug on Riddler, who's now an addict, and so they dispatch an assassin to go off Riddler basically because he's another loose end in the scheme that they're concocting, which it's not entirely clear what they're up to yet, only that some of our heavy-hitting Batman rogues gallery are in danger. Towards the end of the book, Catwoman shows up to rescue the Riddler from the assassin, who is basically like an enhanced human that can sort of like digitize themselves to pass through people while they're fighting. Think basically like the Flash's vibration powers, except synthetic. And we get into a chase between Riddler, Catwoman, and this metahuman, which leads to some pretty cool art sequencing. I really thought that the choreography of this chase was really, really well done. It's laid it out in a way where the sequence of events is really, really vivid in your mind as you're reading it. And I like that. It had a lot of character. Another thing I liked about this book was just how Catwoman interacts with the rogues gallery. We saw a little bit of this in Tynion's Batman earlier in his run, where she's kind of like, you know, she still has one foot in, one foot out within the rogues gallery. It's kind of like, you know, friends that she's had for a really long time, and now she's kind of moved to a new place, but they keep kind of, they're still important to her, and so she still has a responsibility to them, even though, you know, she's personally in a different place. And so seeing her step in to rescue the Riddler, and I'm sure get involved with Poison Ivy in the next issue, was just kind of a fun direction to take her character, and I liked how Tynion did it in Batman, and it looks like they're continuing that kind of thread in this Catwoman book, which is exciting. I like it. So speaking of Ram V, he did do the backup story, Justice League Dark, in Justice League, which I actually thought I had almost gotten away with an entire week without backup stories, and then I remember Justice League had one. But then I also remembered I was more excited about the backup than I was about actual Justice League. I do like Justice League Dark. I haven't read it in quite a while, but I always liked the concept. It was just a good utilization of the magic side of the DC universe, plus playing to some of those Vertigo horror elements. So I was excited to come back to it now and just see kind of how things were going. And so as I opened this book, I immediately had a flashback to The Outsiders from last week. And I remembered that I was complaining, how can you have a team book in 8 pages? And I immediately got worried that Justice League Dark would fall prey to a similar situation. I have to say, upon reading this book, it basically solves the riddle of how do you do a team book in 8 pages in the same way Outsiders does, which is that you only actually have 2 characters in this. You have Zatanna and John Constantine, who now appear to be in some kind of relationship. Not sure if that was established before or if that's kind of a newer development. I'm assuming that that's been going for a little while. And they're basically traveling across the country. They're in New Mexico, and they run into Jason Blood, who tells them that something beyond knowing has returned. The rest of the book is spent setting up that threat, which in this case is Merlin. I don't know a lot about Merlin in the DC universe. I remember he was in Demon Knights, but it's been so long since I've read that, I really couldn't bring that knowledge to this book. But they do a really good job over a few pages setting up him as a new threat. He claims Excalibur from the stone, which is hidden away, and he pulls a jewel off of the bottom of the sword. It turns out he doesn't want the sword at all, and he's after this jewel, which is going to somehow play into the story that's going to unfold. While it felt similar to Outsiders in terms of the way Ram V approached the story, the difference with this was I really did understand who the villains were, generally what the stakes were going to be. It was a good setup for a story that it has yet to unfold. I hope he can continue this pacing in a way that's effective so that the story has the opportunity to breathe. But overall, a good start, just really, really hard to judge based on just 8 pages. Oh yeah. And then also there was the Justice League title itself. Brian Michael Bendis' book ended up being the last thing that I read. I have never read a Brian Michael Bendis DC book before. I was super into Daredevil way back in the day. I never really got into any of the other stuff that he wrote. And I've heard that people are not happy with Brian Michael Bendis these days. But I tried to go in with an open mind. Unfortunately, the way this book is written made that a very challenging prospect for me. So I want to take a little closer look at just the very first page of this, which is a conversation going on between Green Arrow and Black Canary. When regular people see us, they see icons, symbols. They don't see us. I understand how it happened. It's a perspective thing. We're all the way up there all the time. But I think that's why the Justice League doesn't always work. And then Black Canary says, "How could you say that?" And Green Arrow responds, "I think that's why I like Clark revealing himself as Superman. People like him more now." And she says, "They always liked him." And he says, "But now people feel more relaxed around him. They relate to him. They feel closer. People feel they understand him more." I found that dialogue a little bit perplexing, because as I was reading it, I was like, well, people have always loved Superman. Like, that's kind of his MO, is that he is approachable, despite the fact that he's an alien from Krypton, super powerful. Like, if you're not a criminal, he's approachable, because at the end of the day, he's also just guy from Kansas raised on a farm. There's an element of this dialogue that feels very self-congratulatory, because I know that Brian Michael Bendis is the person who revealed Superman's identity, and so that was off-putting, but it also felt like it misunderstood the character, because as Quentin Tarantino pointed out in Kill Bill, Clark Kent is the disguise. Superman is who Clark Kent really is. It's not Clark Kent is who Superman really is. Clark Kent is a facade he puts on as a matter of necessity and convenience. Superman is who he is at heart. So him revealing his secret identity isn't the same as like when Daredevil was outed back in those books back in the day. Like for Daredevil, Matt Murdock's life and livelihood depended on there being a separation between Matt Murdock and Daredevil. And so when you took that away, it made his life significantly more complicated. For Superman, and I don't know what they've done in those stories since he's been revealed, to be fair, but it just doesn't have the same emotional weight to it, because Clark Kent is the facade, and if he needed to, he could just take another identity if he really had to. So I wanted to go into detail on that because it just kind of set my mood as I was going further into the book. So once you get into the book at heart, basically it's a big punch fest between the Justice League, Black Adam, and a giant horned monster named, ironically or unironically, Brutus. They punch him a bunch of times. He decides to take a portal to wherever he came from, and then the Justice League goes back to the Hall of Justice to discuss the events and add a new member to the team. There just wasn't a lot to the actual story. The thing that really drug it down was the fact that the way Brian Michael Bendis writes Brutus like a sassy teenager, which I found really grating just because sassy teenagers are annoying. But also there's like kind of an added cringe factor because like, you have like basically like 60-year-old white dude trying to write for kids, and it just doesn't ring true to me. Obviously mileage may vary on that, but to me it just felt pretty forced. It kind of felt like if you taught an artificial intelligence to write dialogue based on nothing but every tweet that's ever been put on Twitter, you just don't get something that feels like realistic dialogue. I will say in the book's favor, it does have good art. The art is done by David Marquez. Throughout the fight, there's a lot of high moments for the art. Brutus gets thrown into the ocean and Aquaman sicks a whole bunch of sharks on him, which is just well realized in the art. You have some cool, layout designs. I'm always a sucker for those. And then there's a moment where Hawkgirl, the nth metal in her mace, reacts with Brutus himself, and you get this kind of colorful kaleidoscope, which was kind of neat. So, I mean, there are good things in the book. At the end of the day, though, the dialogue and just kind of some weird representations for the characters made this book fall pretty flat for me. Ranking these was pretty easy since there were only 3. Bottom of the pile easily was Justice League. If you could say Justice League Dark, it would probably be towards the top, but I have to really rate these books based on the main story that they feature. Unfortunately, Justice League Dark is only 8 pages. It's not enough to kind of redeem the rest of it. Certainly not worth $4.99 to get your Justice League Dark fix. That's just the reality of it. Runner-up to the top was Nightwing, which, really good book. I debated about putting it as my number 1, but again, it just felt a little too much like a 0 issue for me to really give it full marks. It could easily be top next week, depending on where the story goes. Which means book of the week this week has to go to Catwoman. I did enjoy this book a lot. While the story is intriguing, the main thing that took me through was the art and the layouts. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's reviews, and I'll be back next week with another round of Infinite Frontier books. Have a good one.